Good afternoon and welcome to You and Your Business with me, Alec on 103.2 Dublin City FM. Each week, I invite an expert from the world of business to share their knowledge, insights and tips to help you with your business challenges. If there's a topic you would like covered, or if you feel you can make a contribution, please email me at yourbusiness@dublincityfm.ie. Perhaps we'll be having a chat here one day soon. My guest today has more than 25 years experience in sales. He's the author of Persuade and Purpose, and he works with organizations to help them craft their message and tell their story. And he's an old friend to the You and Your Business studio. Believe it or not, we had our first interview on the 21st of June, 2019, which is still on my SoundCloud channel if you want to go back and hear that. I'm delighted to welcome Eric Fitzpatrick to the You and Your Business studio. Hi, Eric.
Hi. How are you? Delighted to be here.
My goodness, I couldn't believe the number of years that had passed since our last interview, and a lot has changed. Perhaps we might kick off though with our audience just to give them a brief sort of resume, since they may not remember going back that far.
Look, and you're right, first of all. I mean, it's been 3 years and it's been a roller coaster for so many people over the last time, in that period of time. For me, it's been, in some ways, it's been more of the same, only doing it online. And in principle, that is looking after organizations and helping them to craft their message, tell their story, and ultimately to increase the chance of getting their clients or even their colleagues to buy into those messages.
I mean, you might remind our audience how you got into sales in the first place.
Oh, sales all those years ago, it was really a case of how do I want to go forward with what I'm doing, working for the particular organization that I was working for. And there was an opportunity presented itself. There was a sales professional that we had who'd taken a couple of weeks leave. They needed somebody to cover it. And I went, I give it a go. No idea what I was doing. And I always remember one of the very, very first calls that I ever made. I was back out 5 minutes later and I had this great big long list, and I'd seen it on the guy's desk thinking that I was getting this big order.
Right.
And unknown to me, he had a list of all the stock he wanted to return because
oh, no.
The sales professional before me had been loading him because he'd had free run of the client's premises and stock control.
Wow.
Yes.
What an awkward situation that was.
But you know what, Alec, and I will say this, I think everybody should work in sales at some stage, because the life lessons that you learn, whether it's being able to handle rejection, whether it's being resilient, whether it's learning how to craft your message in a way that you can influence people, I think it is a valuable insight. I think everybody should be open to getting involved in it.
Well, I think unbeknown to most people, they are involved in sales in some way or other once they're working for anybody.
Yes. Number one, you're right. Number two, I think the problem with that is a lot of people don't like being associated with sales. It has negative connotations. But I think the problem with that is, and I don't want to get myself into trouble here, but there are certain professions, dare I say, like car salespeople, who have a reputation, rightly or wrongly, for mis-selling, if you want to phrase it that way. But really good professional selling is absolutely a noteworthy profession. And I think people should be proud of it when they're involved in it.
Yes, I think so. As you said, people have the stereotypes in their mind that somebody's trying to force something that's of poor value onto some poor unsuspecting punter out there.
Yeah, very much so. And it's one of those things that pushes people away from dealing with sales professionals, but equally it pushes people away from want to be seen as being part of that profession. Yeah,
it's a terrible shame, because sales is the core of every business. If you're not selling, you really don't have a business. Well,
was it Brian Tracy who said nothing happens until a sale is made? Yeah. So you can work in IT, you can work in service, you can work in operations, but there's nothing to maintain, there's nothing to pack up and send out the door unless the sale has been made.
Exactly. And I think that's very relevant. Just talk about, I mean, from yourself, we haven't spoken since sort of COVID. That changed the landscape completely for so many organizations. And how did you, manage for yourself and then manage to help the organizations you work with around it?
Well, first of all, and I still remember this, it was the 12th of March, 2020. I was delivering training over in the Irish Management Institute, and my coordinator, Christelle, she walked in 11 o'clock in the morning and she said, If you don't mind, I'm just going to interrupt. We'll be closing the building at 5 o'clock today, and you won't be back tomorrow. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time when COVID is behind us.
All right.
Little did anybody know at the time that a couple of weeks was potentially going to become a couple of years.
Yes.
And for me, there was an element of, in the first couple of weeks, it was literally a case of, like it was for so many people in my industry doing what I do, it was order after order after order getting cancelled. And at one stage, I looked at the book, if you want to call it that, and there was nothing in the diary.
Wow.
And there was an element of, so what happens now? What's just happened, followed by what happens now, and where is this going to lead to? But when I sat and I looked at it, the thing that struck me was that people, it wasn't that people went, we don't want to continue training, or it wasn't that people went, we don't have the budgets for training. It was the manner in which we currently deliver training is no longer available to us. So once people got over the shock of that, it became a case of, so what can we do? And as you know, everything then went online. And slowly but surely, people started getting some sort of a handle of what it could look like and how it could be actually delivered.
And it's quite interesting because the sort of last traumatic event, you might say, in business would have been the recession of 2008. Mm-hmm. So there's been a nice sort of free run since then. But to get something that's not recession based, but has the power to create one, must have been a serious challenge.
Yeah, and I think the big difference was 2008, there was a huge amount of redundancies. People didn't have money and people weren't spending money on training. This time, it was more a case of, what are we actually going to do? How do we do it? And there were organizations that needed to work out how to do it, or else they wouldn't have survived. So it was different in that regard. And I said, it was a case of, okay, so how do we actually do it? How do we learn to do this online?
And if you're just joining us now, you're listening to You and Your Business with me, Alec Drew, on 103.2 Dublin City FM, where my studio guest today is Eric Fitzpatrick. And just talking about, I think people were caught in the headlights of that sort of March 2020. But like all business, you have to react in some way. So and that's what we saw.
For me, Alec, the big thing was, I sat and I looked at the clients that I had and I went, these clients will come back. It's just a question of my being ready for them. And what I reasoned was that it wasn't just about delivering the training online, it was how do you make it engaging online? And that was the big concern for me, because I like to think that a lot of the training that I deliver is engaging. So I put a lot of time and effort into that. And what it meant was that I think two things happened. First of all, when it started, we were all doing no more than 2-hour sessions and taking breaks and then bringing people back in the afternoon. And then very quickly, and it wouldn't have been exclusive to me, a number of people worked out, actually, I could have people online from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock once I can make it engaging for them. So that became hugely important. And what I would say is, I think that one of the ways training changed from my perspective was I probably removed some of the content that I would have been delivering.
All right.
In exchange for, how do I make sure I keep audiences engaged?
Yes.
In that regard, it became more a case of giving control of some of the training sessions to the actual people themselves and making them much more active participants in it. And it had a huge impact in terms of how some of the training was received. And I know that when I look at some of the clients that I've worked with, it made it easier for them to go, let's use Eric again, because we're getting a reasonable reaction we're getting a good reaction from the people that were putting through his training. So that was hugely important for me. The other thing then, Alec, was in the early days, from March, April, May, there was very, very little happening.
Yes.
So what it did for me was it allowed me to take the content of Persuade on Purpose and turn it into an online course or an online resource. And I refer to it as both because when people can work their way through from video 1 right through to a video 102 or 104, whatever it is, right, it's equally a case of, on those occasions that you're crafting that presentation and you want to work out how to make it a little bit more engaging, you can go directly to that particular section. You don't have to follow it through in a chronological order. And that's been hugely beneficial to the business as well.
No, that's fantastic. I think also people in the world of training, as you are, Eric, there was a real opportunity there, because now people had more time because we're spending 3 hours less a day on the road and the rest.
Do you know what I found really interesting was, and as you know this yourself, before COVID, you'd have a client who would book you for a day. And when I say a day, that could be 2 hours, it could be 4 hours, it could be the full day. But they got the full day regardless of how much time they booked, because you couldn't travel to where the next client might be if they wanted you on the same day. That changed with COVID.
Yes.
Myself and I know other colleagues as well, we might have been online in the morning for half a day. We might have had a 2-hour session in the afternoon with a completely different client. And in some cases then been online in the evening time as well. So I've certainly had days when it was 3 different clients in the same day.
In terms of changing the content to reflect the changing aspect of how it was being delivered, any sort of tips or hints around that? Now, obviously, your course would be a good place to go, and I look forward to having a look at it. But were there any key changes that you thought needed to be made?
Well, when I do the Persuade on Purpose training, Alec, I think you've seen this. One of the exercises that I would do at the very, very beginning was get people to tear up a sheet of A4 paper. And obviously I couldn't do that. Yeah. So it did become a case of, how do I deliver the same message in that particular way? So it became a little bit more creative in trying to do the same things. So what I do now is, if it's online, is I get people to draw an elephant. And at the end of drawing the elephant, you can see the different elephants that have been drawn. You can have a little bit of fun with people, because some people cannot draw and should never be let near pen and paper when it comes to drawing anything. So in that regard, it became, do that. It also became, when you were putting people into the breakout rooms, give them the time that they needed and be comfortable with it. And equally, when they came back out of the breakout rooms, give them the time required to be able to discuss what they had covered. And what I found was that people felt much more involved and enjoyed the training much more when they were learning from each other and when their voices could be heard. So I think to a certain extent, many of us became more facilitators than trainers. We created the environment where people had the opportunity to be able to express themselves, which was hugely important. The other thing I think that was really important as well, Alec, was it was recognizing the circumstances under which people were attending the training.
Yes.
Because for the majority of us, we never ever intended to allow people look inside our homes. No. And most people didn't have the facilities to do what we do. I made the decision early on that I was going to work from my kitchen table. And the reason for that was that when I'd get to 5 o'clock in the evening, I had to pack everything away. So it was much harder to take the laptop back out again and work in the evening time. But for some people, it was the spare bedroom.
Yes, of course.
And you knew that there were times when people were uncomfortable revealing this space to you. So I think we had to be very, very mindful of that. And I phrase it this way: create a slightly softer and more accommodating environment for the people who are attending the training.
Yes, it put people under a lot of pressure. You know, we've seen it. I'm sure you've seen it. There's people with children on their lap. There's pets running around, you know, things you would never have seen in a face-to-face event.
But in saying that, I mean, on the one hand, I think what it's done is it's revealed a human element.
Yes.
Because sometimes we see the profession before we see the person. It's very easy, as you know, for people to leave who they are at the office door and just come in and be the accountant or the lawyer or the IT professional, whatever it is. Where here you got to see this insight into who the person was and what was important to them. I was working with somebody recently, and on the back wall behind him, he had these absolutely fabulous prints of Marvel characters. And we ended up spending about 10 minutes talking about them before we actually get into the training. But connections can be made doing that.
Well, I'm sure as part of your course, you warn people about their backgrounds as well, because while the Marvel might have been fantastic, I always think of the person stepping out of the shower in one of them, you know. I shouldn't have been there. So, you know, people have to be.
And there were horror stories in the early days, weren't there?
Yeah,
there were absolute horror stories, whether it was the husband who stepped out of the shower completely naked behind the CEO of a business, or it was even the group of 4 people who had worked together for many, many years, and they went to take a break, and one of them stood up and was only in his underwear, which was far more information than any of his colleagues ever needed to see. Yes,
that's classic. But I mean, these will be the things talked about the future. You know, when we look back at these times, unfortunately, I mean, there's still an element of it floating around, but hopefully we're over the worst of it. In terms of you've talked about your own business and the online course. Again, there might be many out there who would be interested in creating an online course. How did you go about that?
There were a couple of things. First of all, and in fairness, Alec, and I would say this not just in relation to the online course, but even to delivering the training online, there was certainly an element in the early days of, I don't know what I'm doing. Who can I learn from? And in terms of the online course, I think it's the Digital Institute, John Kilroy at the Digital Institute was brilliant for delivering some training early on and creating materials that we could all use and draw from to be able to create worthwhile training. And then, and I was very, very fortunate in one sense, because I'd been thinking about the online course before COVID kicked in. So I had bought a lot of the equipment beforehand, the webcam, the microphones, the ring, the lights, etc. And thankfully I did, because as I'm sure you're aware, the manufacturers from Logitech and some of these other manufacturers suddenly saw an opportunity to absolutely gouge prices, and the prices went up significantly. Yeah. I remember at one stage, a camera that I'd paid something like 60 or 70 quid for was now about 300 or 400 quid.
Wow. Yeah.
But at that stage, so I was comfortable that I could deliver training early on. Then I sat down and I looked at, if I was going to do the online course, what was involved in that. I took a couple of online tutorials. And then, and I'll be honest, I say to people, you're familiar with the phrase, what is done is better than perfect. So yes, it became a case of, let's get it done. Let's record the videos. I got somebody to edit the videos for me. I had all the editing equipment. We've edited them, prepared them, and then I looked for the different platforms that would host them, and I chose Kajabi as the platform that I would use, that I use, and created them, and they're out there, and yeah, they're absolutely fine. I say to people, are they the best videos in the world? Absolutely not, because that's not my area of expertise. But is there really good content in the videos? Absolutely.
Yeah, and you're right, get them out there. They don't have to be perfect. I always use the analogy of the painter, the artist. He could look at that painting for the rest of his life and still be adding little bits to it. Yeah, but there is a time to put it out for sale.
Yeah, and I think as well, Alec, I don't know anybody else's take on this, but I know that from my perspective, and I would say this to any of your listeners, there will be people listening to this who might have a book in them, might have an online course in them, but might question whether people would want to listen to their expertise. And what I say to people is, get it out there. Mm-hmm. The worst that will happen is people will turn around and say you're an author, and you can find a way to utilize that product, whether it is a book, whether it is an online course. And as I said to you before we started this interview, for me, my business has always been B2B. It's the client companies that I work with. I've never actively pursued B2C business. And in theory, an online course would be B2C business. But the decision that I made was that I was going to use it to increase value for my B2B clients. And what it allowed me to do, COVID allowed me to do two things. One, it allowed me to really evaluate the business and identify what I was doing that I wanted to stop doing. And I have got rid of nearly 90% of that. There's a couple of things that I'm still doing, but they're legacy clients, so I'll keep them. But the other thing it then did was it allowed me to look at my pricing.
Right.
And one of the reasons it became really important to look at the pricing was because, and all trainers will tell you this, we had clients who went, well, you're not traveling down to where we are. You're not staying in a hotel. You're only doing a couple of hours online in the morning and a couple of hours online in the afternoon. So you can't be charging us the same fee, without actually recognizing that the work for the trainers actually became harder.
Yes, and it required more work. And if you're just joining us now, you're listening to You and Your Business with me, Alec Drew, on 103.2 Dublin City FM, where my studio guest today is Eric Fitzpatrick. And yes, people wanted to get you to discount your prices. Now, as somebody who's in sales, Eric, you should know how to handle the pushback on that.
What I did was I put my prices up. I remember a great story, reading a great story many, many years ago, but I think it was Smirnoff vodka. And a new kid on the block came out selling a different vodka. It was that little bit cheaper than Smirnoff. And some of the Smirnoff executives panicked and said, what should we do? And a wise head said, why don't we put our prices up so that we clearly differentiate the value between what we offer and the cheaper vodka? And that was what I did. I put my prices up.
Yes.
And when people queried them, I would ask them how many people they'd have attending the training, and I would offer to give the course to everybody attending. Yes. And the basic product is 195 quid. And if you've 10 people attending, it was an extra £2,000 worth of value. And without exception, everybody went, that's okay. Okay, I'll do that. Yeah. And it suddenly seemed like really good value. And ultimately, and what I suspect is, and I think that also, when you talk about the sales background, one of the things that I learned many, many years ago is I might be talking to you about sales, but there's things going on at your end that I'm not aware of.
Yes, of course.
That are influencing the conversation we're having. And one of them might be you having to go back to somebody who's signing the check to go, here's what I've just spent money on. And they're going to go, well, where's the value in that? I would change from putting slides up on screen to shutting them down to talk to the people on screen and then try to bring the slides back up. The whole thing would freeze and it wouldn't work.
Right.
The device obviously wasn't powerful enough to be able to take it. So I ended up having to buy a new device.
I suppose, Eric, when we're talking about the word cheap, that has all sorts of connotations. So people never want to buy a cheap course,
People don't want to buy anything cheap. They want something that has real value for them, but they don't always want to pay that price, or they don't always recognize the value of what they're actually getting. And to your point, it might be cheap today, but if it wins you, even take the course as the example. Sure. If one person on your team delivers a presentation and that's the one that wins a contract that might be worth £1 million, the 195 quid it becomes completely irrelevant and insignificant. But the perception is at that moment in time, it's people looking and going, is there value in this? And do I really want to pay that price for it? And can I see that value? And often people, in my opinion, can't always see the value.
I think also the skill around selling, Eric, which you certainly have and it would help others to understand, is people come out, for example, I always think of the analogy of the car salesman, and I don't mean in the derogatory one, but he comes out, wants to explain the combustion engine to a potential purchaser, as opposed to how this car will get you from A to B, and you and the 3 kids and the dog.
Yes. Yeah. I do a lot of work with research centers out of many of the different universities, and they love talking about the research. They really do. Without actually remembering that they're trying to tell a story. And I think the very same thing applies to sales. You're trying to paint a picture in the mind of your audience, and the majority of people don't care about how the car works. They just care about how it makes them feel and how it'll meet their need, as you said, of getting themselves and the 3 kids and the 2 pets and wherever it is to the beach or wherever it is they're going to go to. But I think the other side of that is, I think when it comes to sales, too often people talk about their product, their service, and their idea. And I think really good sales professionals spend most of the time asking questions, gathering information, trying to understand exactly what the challenge is before they even attempt to offer a solution to that. And I think often that's where sales fall down, because the people who look to push their products too soon give the impression that they're only interested in trying to make that sale, as opposed to trying to help the person that they're having the conversation with.
And I think that's a very valuable tip that you've identified for people there. As you said, instead of understanding the real needs of the person and the impact it's likely to have on their life, they're rushing in to sell them something that they probably either don't want or don't care about.
Yeah, I mean, even something simple, Alec, and I know we've had this conversation before. I was talking to somebody on Friday, and I have a 4-hour rule when it comes to responding to voicemail or email. Don't always hit it, but that's what I aim for. And even if it's just an email that says to somebody, I've got your email, but I'm in training today, I'll be back to you tomorrow with a detailed response.
Yeah.
And my view is that when you get back to people that quickly, you're demonstrating that you see them as being important, you see them as being valuable, and you're respecting their time and everything else to do with them. And what it does for the other person is it lets them see that you're genuinely interested in them. And it's one less thing that they then have to think about. So it's taking a genuine interest in that other person. And I think the key to really good selling is taking a genuine interest in the person that you're trying to sell to.
Yes. And I think in today's sort of world of instant gratification, even some sort of email to respond to say that I recognize that you've been trying to be in contact with me, but I will be back to you at such a point, I think is so important that so many people miss out on.
Yeah, and we all get wrapped up in what we're doing. We get so focused on what we need to achieve that we often forget what's important to the other side. And as an example of that, Alec, and again, I know we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. There's been this email that Stripe sent out to our employees recently about the layoffs. And it's been touted as this example of great leadership communication. And I think it's anything but. I think it's, with respect, the Collison brothers trying to protect themselves and their business, which is their right. But sending an email to somebody to say that you're about to be let go is no way to do it. So it's not taking into consideration what is going to be hugely important to the people on the receiving end of those emails.
No, and I think that's so important. I suppose we're just at wrap-up stage here, Eric. So maybe you might remind the audience where they might find out more about you and your online course.
So the online course they will find at www.persuadeonpurpose.com.
Right.
And they want access to me or the other programs that I deliver. It's www.arcspeakingandtraining.com, and I'm available on eric@arcspeakingandtraining.com or at 087 285 1878.